Welcome, and we've reached Psalm 49 in our ponderings journey through the Psalms. It's a very different sort of psalm. It's not one of the laments or cries of despair that we've read elsewhere. It certainly isn't a great paean of praise and thanksgiving to God. In fact, in many ways, it reads more like part of wisdom literature. And it's often what we call either a didactic or a teaching psalm or a wisdom psalm. Now, those of you that have watched a number of these videos will know that I'm always trying to give you little clues and keys to unlocking the structure and meaning of a psalm. And one of those keys is that of repetition. And there are two strong elements of repetition in this psalm that I want you to notice. Verses 12 and 20 are almost identical. Man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beasts that perish. And then you get the word ransom that comes three times. In verse 7, again in verse 8, and down in verse 15. So here are three things we're going to think about from this psalm. There's riches, there's ransom, and then there's resurrection. Now the last of those is implicit rather than explicit, but the first two are explicit and repeated. So first of all, here's the first lesson. Don't be afraid of the rich. Twice the psalmist says that. In verse 5, and again in verse 16. We're not to fear the materialistically minded, those who seem to be affluent and well off in the things of this world. We're not to fear them. And he gives a number of reasons why we shouldn't fear them, why riches are not worth pursuing. Number one, because verse 14, death is the shepherd of the rich and the materialistic. Death is the one that shapes and guides and leads them. That's where they're heading. What a contrast to the Lord is the shepherd of the believer. Secondly, we're told in verses 7 and 8 that death cannot save them. All the money in the world won't pay a ransom for their souls. Thirdly, we're told that death will not enable them to riches will not enable them to avoid death. Verse 9. You can have all the money in the world, but you'll still end up the same as the poorest person, dead. And fourthly, we shouldn't fear them because they cannot take their money with them. They'll leave everything behind. There are, as they say, no pockets in shrouds. So why fear the rich? Don't fear the rich. Secondly, says the psalmist, don't follow the rich. Notice what he says in verse 13. This is the path of those of foolish confidence, yet after them people approve of their boast. Don't follow the rich. Don't envy them. Don't try and copy them, because they have nothing worth having of any eternal and spiritual value. So there's a focus on riches. Secondly, there's a focus here on ransom. It comes, as I mentioned, in verse 7, in verse 8, and in verse 15. Now see, rich people may have everything the world has to offer them, but it cannot save their souls, because their soul is too costly to be bought purely by silver and gold. But here's the promise for the believer. God, verse 15, will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol. Sheol will shepherd and lock in and capture the materialistic and those who live for their money. And they cannot be released. There's no ransom big enough to pay for that. But God will ransom the soul of the believer. We will not remain in death. God will ransom and has ransomed us from death with the precious blood of Christ. I think of these verses, I'm thinking of where Peter says that we are ransomed not with costly things like silver and gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. So are you one who's following riches, or are you one who is treasuring the fact that you have been ransomed? But here's the third R from this psalm. It's very brief, far brief that I would like in many ways. It's the idea of resurrection. Now the word doesn't appear here, but the thought is clearly here. Look at what we're told in verse 14. Halfway through the verse, the upright shall rule over them in the morning. In the morning, in the beginning of the new day. And verse 15, God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol. He will receive me. See, our end is not the grave. Our end is not death. The sky, not the grave, is our goal. The idea of God will receive me reminds me of God and Enoch. And Enoch was not, because God took him. And God will receive me. God will take me home at the end of this life. So if my heart is in riches and material things, then I'm lost. If my heart is in the God who has ransomed me with far greater riches than I could ever know in this life, then I have the resurrection morning to look forward to and to enjoy for all eternity. May the Lord bless you.